The Consciousness Code Podcast, episode 22 Minds at War. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code Podcast. In this episode, we move from the mystery of consciousness itself into one of the most difficult and intimate contradictions in ordinary life. Why we can know something and still live against it. Why can we see a pattern clearly, name it accurately, even explain where it comes from, and yet still find ourselves pulled back into the same reactions, the same habits, the same choices, and the same inner conflicts. The split between what we say and what moves us. Most of us have felt this split, even if we haven't always known how to describe it. We've felt it in those moments where one part of us seems absolutely clear, while another part quietly continues in a completely different direction. One part says, I don't want this anymore, while another part still reaches for it. One part says, I know I need to slow down, while another part keeps accelerating as if rest itself were dangerous. One part says, I'm not going to react this time, and then the words are already out of our mouth before the comma part of us has even caught up. One part says, I want peace, but another part is still organized around vigilance, tension, control, or defense. That inner contradiction is not rare. It is not strange. It is not a sign that something has gone uniquely wrong inside you. In many ways, it is one of the most ordinary experiences of being alive. Because for most of us, life does not unfold from one perfectly unified center. We like to imagine that it does. We like to think that the mind we hear most clearly is the mind doing most of the work. The part of us that talks, explains, plans, reflects, justifies, and says, that part feels central. It feels like the real driver. It feels like the captain of the ship. And from the inside, that makes sense, because it is the part we know best. It is the part we can hear, the part we can quote, the part we can present to other people, the part that gives reasons and offers narratives and tells the story of who we are. But if that part were fully in charge, life would probably look very different for most of us. If the conscious, reasoning, intentional mind were always leading, then insight would produce change much more quickly than it does. Recognition would be enough. Understanding would be enough. A clear decision would be enough. We would see a destructive pattern and stop. We would recognize a truth and live by it. We would make a promise to ourselves and keep it with relative ease. We would not so often find ourselves saying, why did I do that again? Or why did I say that when I knew better? Or why am I still caught in something I can already see so clearly? And yet that is exactly where so many of us live. Not in ignorance, necessarily. Not in total confusion, but in a kind of split. A split between what we say and what moves us. A split between what we consciously want and what deeper parts of us still expect. A split between the mind we identify with and the layers of patterning, memory, habit, emotional conditioning, and bodily response that seem to run ahead of it. That split shows up everywhere once you begin to notice it. It shows up when someone says they want a healthier relationship, but keeps choosing people who feel familiar in all the wrong ways. It shows up when someone says they are done with overworking, but still feels deeply unsettled the moment they stop being productive. It shows up when someone insists they are not angry while their tone, posture, and pace say otherwise. It shows up when someone knows they need rest, but cannot stop organizing their life around pressure. It shows up when someone wants closeness, but keeps withdrawing the moment intimacy becomes real. It shows up when someone says, I understand why I do this, and yet the understanding never seems to reach the part of them that is actually doing it. And that is where this episode begins. Not with abstract ideas about the mind, not with a cold theory about cognition, but with a lived contradiction that most of us have already felt in our own way. Because there is a real difference between the part of us that speaks in the language of intention and the part of us that seems to move before intention can fully take hold. There is a real difference between seeing something and being free of it. There is a real difference between knowing and embodying. And until we understand that difference, we will keep turning our inner conflict into shame or confusion or self-judgment, when in many cases what we are actually dealing with is a mind that is less unified than it appears. That matters because the way we talk to ourselves about this split shapes how we live with it. If we think the whole of us is represented by our conscious mind alone, then every contradiction begins to look like personal failure. Every repeated pattern looks like a weakness. Every return to an old behavior feels like proof that we are unserious, incapable, or somehow dishonest with ourselves. We say, but I know better, as if knowing better should immediately dissolve whatever is driving the loop. We say, this makes no sense, as if sense were the only thing shaping our actions. We say, why am I still doing this? With a tone that suggests the conscious part of us should have been enough to resolve the issue by now. But perhaps that is the wrong starting point. Perhaps the more truthful place to begin is with the recognition that there is often more moving inside us than the part that can explain itself neatly. Perhaps the voice in the mind is not always the first thing to act. Perhaps the story comes after the shift in the body. Perhaps the explanation comes after the reaction. Perhaps the conscious mind often arrives as commentator, interpreter, or narrator, not always as the source of movement. And if that's true, then the whole inner landscape starts to look different. It means the work is not simply about thinking harder. It means insight, while valuable, may not be enough on its own. It means that one part of us can be utterly sincere while another part remains unconvinced, unregulated, or loyal to something older. It means that inner conflict may be less about hypocrisy and more about layers. It means that we are often not lying to ourselves so much as living through different levels of the mind that do not always move in harmony. That is a much more humane place to start, because many of us know what it is like to feel divided, to want one thing and do another, to understand one thing and feel another, to speak from clarity one moment and react from fear the next, to believe we've moved beyond something, only to realize under pressure that some deeper part of us is still carrying the old script, to have moments of genuine self-awareness, and then find ourselves pulled back into automaticity before that awareness has had time to organize our behavior. This is especially important in a culture that tends to worship decisiveness, certainty, willpower, and self-control. We are often taught to imagine that if we are not changing, we must not want it enough. If we are still repeating a pattern, we must not be trying hard enough. If we are still caught in contradiction, then we must not really mean what we say. But life is not always that simple. Many of us do mean what we say. Many of us are sincere in what we want. Many of us do genuinely long for peace, honesty, healing, clarity, love, or change, and still something in us runs ahead. That is why this episode matters, because until we become more curious about that something, we will keep treating inner contradiction as a moral flaw instead of an invitation to look deeper. And the truth is, inner contradiction is often where real inquiry begins. It begins when you notice that your reactions have a timing you did not consciously choose. It begins when you realize your body shifts before your reasoning forms. It begins when you say yes, only to discover later that you meant no. It begins when you hear yourself speaking with force, only afterwards noticing how threatened you felt. It begins when you can sense that one part of you is trying to move forward, while another part is still bracing against what forward would actually require. Those moments can feel frustrating. They can feel embarrassed. They can feel disappointed, but they are also revealing, because they show us that the mind is not as simple as it first appears. And maybe that is the first thing we need to understand here. The conflict is not proof that you are broken. It may simply be proof that there is more going on than the conscious voice alone can account for. That conscious voice matters. It is not fake. It is not unimportant. It is where reflection happens. It is where language gathers. It is where the decision begins to take shape. It is where we can observe, consider, evaluate, and try to orient ourselves. But it is not the whole story. And the sooner we stop asking it to be the whole story, the sooner we begin to understand why so much of life feels like a tug of war between what we know and what still moves us. That is the emotional center of this episode. Not simply that there are different parts of the mind in some abstract sense, but that this division is lived. It affects how we love, how we argue, how we choose, how we sabotage ourselves, how we pursue what harms us, how we avoid what might heal us, and how we make sense of our own behavior afterwards. It affects self-trust, because one of the most painful consequences of this split is that it can make us feel unreliable in ourselves. We say we'll do one thing and do another. We promise ourselves a change and break the promise again. We speak from truth in one state and abandon that truth in another. And after enough repetitions, we start to lose faith in our own words. So part of what I want this episode to offer is not just explanation, but relief. Relief from the idea that if you are divided, you must be fake. Relief from the idea that if you still repeat a pattern, your insight means nothing. Relief from the idea that if the deeper shift hasn't happened yet, your conscious knowing is somehow worthless. Your conscious knowing does matter, but it may not be the first thing moving. And if we can accept that not as an excuse, but as a deeper truth, then we can begin to observe ourselves more accurately. We can stop asking only, what do I think? And start asking, what moved first? We can stop assuming that the story in the mind is the whole event and begin looking at the sequence. We can become curious about timing, about tension, about emotional loyalty, about protective reflexes, about the old layers still active beneath the thoughts we hear most clearly. That curiosity changes everything. Because once you become curious about what moves first, inner contradiction stops being just a source of shame and starts becoming a map of where insight has not yet reached, a map of where protection is still stronger than intention, a map of where the body still expects what the mind says it no longer wants, a map of where an older version of you is still participating in present life. And that is what we are going to explore in this episode. Not just the fact that we are divided, but the nature of that divide. Not just the experience of saying one thing and doing another, but the deeper structure underneath it. Not just the frustration of the split, but the intelligence hidden inside it. Because the mind we know is only part of the picture. The mind that runs ahead has been shaping more of our lives than most of us realize. The mind we identify with. If part one opened with the split between what we say and what moves us, then part two needs to stay with the side of that split we know most intimately, the part of us we usually call me, the thinking mind, the speaking mind, the explaining mind. The mind that reflects, plans, chooses, comments, justifies, remembers, and narrates. This is the part most of us identify with most strongly because it is the part we can hear. It is the inner voice that says, I should do this. I don't want that anymore. That upset me. I know why I did that. Next time I'll handle it differently. This is what I believe. This is who I am. It feels like the center because it is the part of us that speaks incomplete sentences. That matters more than we usually realize. Because what speaks clearly tends to feel authoritative. What explains itself tends to feel central. What can describe events after they happen gives the impression that it was present at the beginning of them in a deeper way than it sometimes was. The mind we identify with often feels like the true seat of selfhood, not only because it is reflective, but because it is articulate. It gives us continuity. It strings moments together. It tells the story of what happened, why it happened, what it means, and what it says about us. It makes life narratable, and in that sense, it is indispensable. Without this layer of mind, we would struggle to reflect on our experience in the way we do. We would struggle to plan, to evaluate, to compare, to revisit, to make meaning, to recognize patterns across time, to form intentions, to revise ourselves consciously. This part of us is not trivial. It matters deeply. It is the place where thought becomes visible to itself. It is where we turn inward and say, what am I doing? Why did I do that? What do I really want? What kind of life am I building? It is where conscience often becomes verbal. It is where values become thought. It is where the inner life becomes legible enough to work with. So I do not want to reduce this part of the mind or treat it as some shallow illusion. It is real. It matters. It carries language, memory, perspective, and self-reflection. It is one of the ways we become available to ourselves. But the reason this episode has to slow down here is that the mind we identify with can also create a very powerful illusion. The illusion that because it can explain, it must have been in charge. That is the subtle trap. The speaking mind is so prominent that it can begin to feel like the whole of us. Its commentary is so constant that it starts to seem like the source of every movement. It says, I decided, I felt, I reacted, I chose, I know, I understand. And because it puts all of that into language, it can become difficult to notice that some of those movements may already have been underway before the conscious voice fully arrived. This is why so many of us trust our explanations more quickly than we trust our timing. We remember what we told ourselves. We remember the reason that formed. We remember the sentence we used. But we do not always remember the exact sequence by which the feeling, the tension, the impulse, the bracing, the defensiveness, or the reaching began. The narrative can feel so complete that it covers the event, which is one of the central things I want to slow down in this part of the episode. The difference between being the narrator of an experience and being the source of what moved in that experience. Those are not always the same thing. The mind we identify with often comes online as commentator, interpreter, organizer, and storyteller. It gives shape to experience. It makes it communicable. It helps us turn feeling into thought and thought into language. But many of us have mistaken that very valuable role for total authorship. We have assumed that because we can describe what happened, we were fully leading what happened. Because we can explain a reaction, we assume the explanation came first. Because we can justify a decision, we assume the justification was the true source of the decision. But that is not always how life unfolds, and most of us know this, at least in flashes. We know it in those moments where a sentence leaves our mouth, and only afterwards do we realize how charged we were. We know it when we say yes before we have felt our resistance. We know it when we feel ourselves withdrawing before we have consciously decided to pull back. We know it when we can sense a reaction moving through us more quickly than our reasoning can organize it. We know it when we hear ourselves explaining something with confidence while another, quieter part of us is not entirely convinced. That does not mean the conscious mind is dishonest. It means it is often late, or at least later than it assumes, and that lateness is very difficult to see if we are over-identified with the voice itself. Because the mind we identify with does not only reflect, it also protects continuity. It wants to feel coherent. It wants to believe that our actions make sense. It wants to believe that our reasons are the real reasons. It wants to preserve a stable image of authorship. So even when something in us moved quickly, emotionally, defensively, or automatically, the thinking mind often rushes to assemble a story that restores order. That story may not be false in every respect. Often it contains truth, but it may still not be the full truth. It may tell us what we can presently bear to know, rather than the whole deeper sequence of what happened. This is why we need to understand the conscious mind with both respect and caution. Respect, because it is the place where reflection becomes possible. Caution, because it can easily mistake its own narration for complete self-knowledge. And if that sounds abstract, you can see it in ordinary life very easily. Think of how often we describe ourselves in ways that are partly true, but not complete. We say, I'm just tired, I'm stressed, that's just how I am. I like being busy, I don't like drama, I'm a direct person. I've always been independent. I'm just protecting my peace. I'm bad at slowing down. I don't trust easily. Now, any one of those statements might contain some truth, but they can also become shortcuts, clean verbal summaries that compress a much more complicated inner reality. The conscious mind likes summaries. It likes identities. It likes phrases that stabilize the self. It likes to gather complexity into something repeatable, and the more often a phrase is repeated, the more it begins to feel like direct self-knowledge. But repetition is not the same as depth. Sometimes what we call self-knowledge is actually self-description that has gone unchallenged for too long, and this is especially true in a culture that values articulation so highly. Many of us are rewarded for sounding self-aware long before we are deeply self-aware. If we can name our feelings, reference our patterns, describe our boundaries, explain our behavior, or speak confidently about our motives, we can begin to look more integrated than we really are. The language itself can create an aura of understanding. It can make us seem more internally settled than we actually feel. This is not because language is bad. It is because language is powerful. It can clarify. It can reveal. It can also cover. It can give genuine form to awareness. It can also substitute for awareness when used too quickly. The mind we identify with lives in language. It thinks in concepts, images, sentences, categories, contrasts, narratives, and labels. That is one of its strengths. But it also means this layer of the mind is especially vulnerable to mistaking verbal order for inner order. If I can say it neatly, perhaps I understand it deeply. If I can explain my behavior, perhaps I have fully assessed what drove it. If I can narrate my values, perhaps my deeper life has already caught up with them. But many of us have experienced the gap. We have heard ourselves speak from clarity and then watched ourselves behave from confusion. We have spoken beautifully about peace and then noticed how organized we still are around vigilance. We have explained our relational patterns and then fallen into them again under pressure. We have named a wound and still do not know what to do when that wound takes over the room. That gap does not make the conscious mind useless. It makes it partial, and that word is important. The conscious mind is not fake. It is not irrelevant. It is not something to distrust completely, but it is partial. It sees some things and not others. It narrates some layers and misses others. It forms intentions that other parts of us may not yet be ready to live. It speaks from one level of the system, but not from all levels at once, and once we accept that, something softens. Because many of us have been far too cruel with ourselves in the face of this split. We have expected our thinking mind to solve what our deeper life has not yet integrated. We have expected an explanation to do the work of embodiment. We have expected clarity to override conditioning immediately. We have expected the mind that can speak to also be the mind that can instantly reorganize the whole system. And when that fails, we judge ourselves harshly. We call ourselves weak. We call ourselves hypocritical. We call ourselves unserious. We say we should know better, as though knowledge automatically rewires what is older, faster, more familiar, and more embodied than the thought itself. But perhaps the real invitation here is not to judge the conscious mind for being insufficient. Perhaps the invitation is to understand its actual role more accurately. The mind we identify with is where conscious relationships begin. It is where we can observe. Where can we name? Where can we question? Where can we interrupt? Where can we become aware of a contradiction? Where can we begin to build honesty? Where we can notice that something deeper in us is not aligned. That is not a small thing. In fact, it is one of the most important capacities we have. Without this reflective layer, the deeper patterns would simply continue without ever becoming visible enough to examine. Without it, we would not be able to look at our lives and ask whether the way we are living matches what we say matters to us. Without it, there would be far less possibility of reorientation, because there would be no inner witness capable of stepping back from the immediate movement and saying, something about this does not match. So this part of the mind deserves more respect than the cynical view often gives it, but it also deserves less total authority than we often assume. It is not the whole of us. It is not always first. It is not always leading, and it is not always telling the whole truth, even when it is sincere. Sometimes it is explaining a reaction it did not initiate. Sometimes it is organizing a story around something older. Sometimes it gives language to a conflict it cannot yet resolve. Sometimes it is announcing a readiness for change that other parts of us have not yet joined. And that is exactly why this episode is called Two Minds at War, because one of those minds is the mind we know best, the mind that thinks in words, makes promises, sets intentions, reflects on patterns, and tries to direct the self. The next part of the episode is about the other side of that inner tension, the deeper, less visible, more automatic layer that often runs ahead of deliberate thought. Once we begin to understand that second layer more clearly, the conflict within us starts to make a different kind of sense. It stops looking like a random inconsistency. It stops looking like a simple weakness. It stops looking like meaningless self-sabotage, and it begins to look more like a relationship between layers, one visible, one less visible, one speaking, one moving, one reflective, one predictive, one conscious, one already in motion before the story has fully begun. That is where we go next. The mind that runs ahead. So if the conscious mind is the part of us that speaks, explains, reflects, and says I, then what is this other layer we keep feeling beneath it? What is this quieter force that seems to move before thought has fully formed? What is this deeper patterning that can tense the body before the mind has named the threat, pull us towards a familiar loop before we've consciously chosen it, or make us react in ways our reflective self only understands afterwards? This is where we begin to talk about what is often called the subconscious. That word can mean different things depending on who's using it. In popular culture, it sometimes gets treated as something mystical, hidden, or almost magical. In psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science, language is often more precise. People speak about implicit processing, automaticity, predictive processing, non-conscious appraisal, habit systems, procedural memory, implicit memory, and fast versus slow processing. Different fields use different terms, but they are circling a similar recognition. A great deal of what shapes our behavior, perception, emotion, and interpretation is happening beneath the level of immediate conscious awareness. Not because we are broken, not because consciousness is fake, But because the mind is layered, the body is fast, and life moves through systems that were never designed to wait politely for reflective thought before they respond. That is a very important point. Most of us were not built to think our way into every action from scratch. If we had to consciously calculate every movement, every facial expression, every small relational cue, every possible threat, every familiar route, every repeated skill, every shift in the room, we would barely function. So the mind and body evolved to automate huge parts of life. Repetition becomes a pattern. Pattern becomes prediction. Prediction becomes speed, and speed, in many situations, is useful. That is why your hands do not need a philosophical discussion before catching something falling from a table. It is why you don't consciously reconstruct language from zero every time someone speaks to you. It is why your posture changes when tension enters a room before you have fully named that tension. It is why certain places, tones, expressions, or silences can alter your internal state before you've consciously decided what they mean. Something in us is always scanning, comparing, sorting, and preparing, and most of that does not announce itself in full sentences. This is where a lot of modern cognitive science overlaps with what many of us feel in lived experience. Dual process theories, for example, often distinguish between fast, automatic, intuitive processing and slower, more deliberate, reflective processing. You could describe that in many ways, but at the level of lived experience, it often feels like this. One layer of you is already moving. Another layer arrives and tries to understand. Daniel Kahneman popularized this distinction for a wider audience through the language of System 1 and System 2, one fast, associative, efficient, emotionally colored, and often automatic, the other slower, more effortful, deliberate, and analytical. That model is not a total map of the mind, and no serious thinker would say it captures everything. But it does help illustrate a truth most of us recognize. The mind that reacts is often not the same as the mind that later explains. And if you've ever found yourself saying, I don't know why I did that, or I knew better but still did it, then you've already met the gap between those layers. But I want to go a bit deeper than the simple fast versus slow idea, because this deeper layer is not only about speed, it is also about history. The subconscious mind, or if you prefer, the implicit mind, is not just a quick response machine. It is a patterned response system shaped by prior experience. It learns. It learns from repetition. It learns from safety and threats. It learns from reward and punishment. It learns from attachment, conflict, stress, shame, unpredictability, affection, absence, and emotional climate. It learns from what happened once, and even more from what happened repeatedly. Once something has been learned deeply enough, it can begin to operate without needing conscious permission every time. That is not abstract. That is your life. If you grew up in an atmosphere where tension often arrived before words, your system may become highly sensitive to tone long before the rational mind has anything neat to say about it. If love felt inconsistent, you may find yourself craving closeness and distrusting it at the same time. If approval was linked to performance, rest may begin to feel less like peace and more like exposure. If conflict meant danger, your body may organize around appeasement, withdrawal, or over-explaining before you've consciously chosen any of those strategies. Here's the important part. Once those strategies are learned deeply enough, they no longer feel like strategies. They feel like you. They feel like instinct. They feel like common sense. They feel like reality. They feel like just how I am. They feel like the obvious way to move. That is one reason the subconscious is so hard to recognize while it is operating. It does not always feel foreign. It often feels natural precisely because it has become familiar. In neuroscience, some of this maps onto what we know about implicit memory and procedural learning. Explicit memory is the kind you can usually describe, such as facts, events, autobiographical details, and things you can consciously recall and talk about. But implicit memory is different. It lives more in patterns, reactions, expectations, conditioned responses, motor habits, and emotional associations. You may not remember the original moments that shaped a certain response, but your system may still carry the pattern. So someone may say, I don't know why I tense up around that tone of voice, and that may be completely sincere. They may not have a clear autobiographical narrative available to explain it, but the body and the deeper predictive systems may have learned something long ago and stored it not as a story, but as readiness. That distinction matters, because a lot of what people call irrational behavior is often not irrational at the level of the nervous system. It may be outdated, overgeneralized, or painful, but it often has a history. The system learned something. The system is organized around it, and now that organization is running ahead of conscious thought. You can see this very clearly in habit research too. Habits are a good example because they show how repeated action gets transferred from effortful decision-making into more automatic circuitry. Early on, a behavior may require conscious effort. Later, it becomes chunked, patterned, and easier to initiate under familiar cues. Neuroscience often points here to the role of the basal ganglia, especially in routine and learned action patterns. Again, we don't need to reduce the whole human story to a brain region, but the broader point is useful. The brain and body are constantly trying to economize. What is repeated becomes easier. What is cued regularly becomes more likely. What is rewarded gets reinforced. So if a person repeatedly reaches for avoidance, overwork, people-pleasing, scrolling, control, food fantasy, argument, performance, or self-criticism in response to discomfort, those patterns can become increasingly fast and increasingly automatic. Eventually, the conscious mind is no longer choosing them in a fresh, deliberate way each time. It is often catching up to a sequence already underway. This is one reason information alone changes so little, because information speaks mainly to the reflective mind. It enters through language, thought, recognition, and explicit understanding. But much of the behavior that troubles us is not organized at that level alone. It is organized through repetition, emotional learning, bodily expectation, and procedural memory. So you can know the healthier pattern intellectually and remain loyal in your deeper system to the older one. That is not because the insight was fake. It is because the insight has not yet reached all the layers involved. And this is where people often become cruel to themselves. They think, if I can see it, why can't I stop it? But seeing is not always the same as rewiring. Naming is not always the same as updating. Recognition is not always the same as regulation. Sometimes the conscious mind is telling the truth, while the deeper system still does not feel safe enough, convinced enough, or organized enough to move differently. And when we fail to understand that, we call it weakness, hypocrisy, or lack of discipline. But many times it is actually a conflict between levels of learning. There's another scientific perspective that deepens this even further: predictive processing. This is one of the most interesting ideas in modern cognitive science, and at a simple level, it suggests that the brain is not just passively receiving reality like a camera. It is actively predicting what is likely to happen based on prior experience, and then updating or resisting those predictions based on incoming signals. In other words, perception is not only about what is there, it is also about what your system expects. That helps explain a lot. Why one person hears a neutral comment as harmless, and another hears criticism. Why one person feels calm in stillness, and another feels threatened by it. Why one person reads silence as peace, and another reads it as withdrawal. Why one person relaxes into praise, and another becomes suspicious of it. The present moment is not arriving in a vacuum. It is arriving in a system already full of prior models. So the subconscious mind that runs ahead is not just impulsive. It is predictive. It is constantly asking, often beneath awareness, what does this mean? What usually happens next? What should I prepare for? What keeps me safe? What has this pattern meant before? Prediction is often fast. We can mistake it for direct perception. We think we are simply seeing reality. But often we are seeing reality through expectation, emotional history, and conditioned readiness. This also helps explain why two people can be in the same situation and live through very different versions of it. Their predictive models are different. Their histories are different. Their implicit expectations are different. So the deeper mind runs ahead in different directions before the conscious story has even begun. Then the reflective mind steps in and says, here is what happened. But by then, much of the event has already been shaped. Now, another area where this gets especially interesting is in the relationship between conscious intention and the timing of action. There are famous experiments, particularly associated with Benjamin Libet, and later variations by researchers like Soon and others, which explored the timing between conscious awareness of deciding and measurable brain activity associated with action preparation. These studies are often oversimplified in popular culture, so it is worth being careful. They do not prove free will is fake in some easy total sense, but they do raise a serious and fascinating question. To what extent does preparatory activity begin before we become consciously aware of deciding? Even with all the debates around interpretation, one thing these experiments help highlight is that the relationship between conscious awareness and action may be less straightforward than we assume. The conscious I choose now may not always be the very first event in the chain. That does not make conscious life meaningless, but it does humble the speaking mind. It reminds us that what we consciously report may be arriving within a process that has already begun, and many of us recognize that without needing a lab. We recognize it in lived experience. The surge of defensiveness, the sudden urge to check out, the reaching for the phone, the tightening in the chest, the impulse to explain too much. The decision is made before the reasoning fully catches up. Scientific research gives language to that, but the lived texture was already there. Another important line of research comes from Antonio Damasio and the idea of somatic markers, the notion that bodily states help guide decision-making, often before we can articulate the reasons clearly. Again, the details are more nuanced than popular summaries usually suggest, but the broader insight is extremely useful. Feeling and bodily signaling are not separate from judgment. The body is participating in evaluation all the time. That matters for our theme here, because it means the subconscious mind is not just in the head. It is embodied. It appears in shifts of breath, in muscle tone, in posture, in facial readiness, in urge patterns, in visceral attraction and aversion, in tightening, bracing, withdrawing, leaning in, collapsing, organizing, scanning. The deeper mind does not only think, it is transmitted through the body. That is why people can be so baffled by themselves. They ask, why did I agree? Why did I shut down? Why did I get angry so quickly? Why did I suddenly feel unsafe? Why did I sabotage that? And the answer often cannot be found by looking only at the words they said to themselves. You have to look at the state of the system, the pattern history, the predictive model, the emotional learning, the bodily cue, and the familiar sequence. You have to ask not only, what did I think, But also, what did my system already believe was happening? That question is often more revealing, because the subconscious layer is deeply involved in what feels familiar, what feels threatening, what feels compelling, what feels intolerable, and what feels like me. It is carrying prior learning in ways that do not always become visible as conscious reasoning. It is not simply hidden content waiting to be discovered. It is an active process. It is an active process. It can create very real inner conflict. One part of you may consciously want closeness. Another part may predict engulfment, disappointment, or rejection. One part may want rest. Another part may associate rest with guilt, vulnerability, or loss of worth. One part may want honesty. Another part may anticipate the cost of being seen too clearly. One part may know the loop is painful. Another part may still experience that loop as safer than the unknown. That is why sabotage is often too shallow a phrase on its own. Sometimes what looks like sabotage is actually protection, just protection organized around an older world. The deeper mind is not always trying to ruin your life. Often, it is trying to keep you within what it already knows how to survive. That is why it runs ahead, because it does not wait for a committee meeting. It is not waiting for your best sentence. It is not waiting for your self-concept. It is not waiting for your latest insight. It is moving according to patterns. It has learned to trust more than your newest conclusion. That can sound discouraging, but it is not meant to be. It is meant to make the inner world more intelligible, because once you begin to understand that there is a predictive, implicit, embodied, fast-moving layer beneath the narrating mind, your relationship to yourself can become much more accurate and much more compassionate. You stop assuming that every contradiction means you are fake. You stop assuming that insight should instantly override history. You stop assuming that because the conscious voice wants change, the whole system is already prepared for it. You begin to recognize that transformation often means bringing different layers of mind into a new relationship, not simply telling yourself better things. Perhaps that is the real depth of this part of the episode. The subconscious mind that runs ahead is not a shadow enemy. It is not a mystical gremlin ruining your plans. It is the faster, older, learned, predictive, embodied layer through which much of life is already being filtered, prepared for, and acted upon before the conscious story has fully formed. It is shaped by memory, repetition, emotion, attachment, threat, reward, and familiarity. It operates through patterns more than explanations. It often becomes visible through its effects, rather than through direct verbal access, and it can remain active even when your conscious mind has already updated its beliefs. That is why so many of us feel split. The mind we know is speaking one language. The mind that runs ahead is still speaking another. Until those layers begin to come into relationship, we will keep finding ourselves in that same painful territory, the territory where insight is real, intention is sincere, and yet something older still moves first. That doesn't mean conscious change is impossible. It means change is deeper than persuasion. It means we need more than better arguments with ourselves. We need observation. We need timing. We need regulation. We need repetition. We need to notice the sequence. We need to understand what the deeper mind is actually trying to do. We need to recognize the conditions under which it takes over. And we need to stop assuming that the story we hear most clearly is the whole story, because it rarely is. And once we accept that, the inner conflict starts to become less mysterious. Still painful, yes. Still frustrating at times, yes. But less mysterious. We begin to see that there is a mind that speaks, and a mind that prepares, a mind that narrates, and a mind that predicts, a mind that explains, and a mind that moves, and the tension between them is not the exception. For many of us, it is one of the central dramas of ordinary life, fast versus slow processing in real life. Once we begin to see that there is more than one layer of mind involved in ordinary experience, the next thing we need to understand is timing. Because one of the reasons inner conflict feels so confusing is that it often happens too quickly for us to witness clearly in the moment. We tend to remember the argument, the sentence, the reaction, the choice, the emotion, and the aftermath. But we do not always catch the sequence by which it unfolded. And that sequence matters because if we miss the order of events, we will almost always misunderstand what is actually driving us. A great deal of our lives comes down to this. Something in us moves fast, and something else arrives later and tries to make sense of it. That fast movement is not always wrong. It is not always irrational. It is not always harmful. In many cases, it is useful. Fast processing allows us to navigate familiar environments, respond to cues, read expressions, orient to danger, and move through repeated tasks without conscious overload. If every moment required deliberate analysis before action, ordinary life would become nearly unmanageable. So speed in itself is not the problem. The problem comes when fast processing is mistaken for clear perception, or when slower reflective awareness arrives too late to influence what is already underway. That is when we start saying things like, "I don't know why I reacted like that. It happened before I could stop it. I only realized what I was feeling afterwards. In the moment it felt obvious, but now I can see I wasn't really seeing clearly." That is the lived gap between fast and slow processing. If part 3 was about the deeper mind that runs ahead, part 4 is about what that actually looks like in real life. Take a simple social moment. Someone's tone changes slightly in conversation. It is subtle, not dramatic, but something in you registers it instantly. Before you have consciously formed a clear interpretation, your body may already have changed. The stomach tightens. The chest hardens slightly. Attention narrows. Your thoughts begin scanning. A second later, you are already leaning toward explanation, defense, withdrawal, or counterattack. By the time the reflective part of you enters fully, the event already has momentum. And because the slower mind arrives inside that momentum, it often mistakes the momentum for truth. That is one of the most important things to understand here. Fast processing often feels true because it feels immediate. The speed gives it force. The force gives it conviction, and conviction can easily be mistaken for clarity. But those are not the same thing. Something can feel immediate and still be shaped by old patterning. Something can feel convincing and still be filtered through prediction. Something can feel urgent and still not be fully about the present moment. That does not mean we should distrust every instinct. It means we should become more literate in sequence. What moved first? What tightened first? What did the body register before the mind turned it into a story? What did the slower mind do when it arrived? Did it examine the reaction or simply justify it? These questions matter because slower processing has a different quality. It tends to involve a pause, comparison, context, reflection, re-evaluation, the ability to hold more than one possibility at once, the ability to notice. This feels true, but I need a moment to see what is actually happening. That capacity is one of the great gifts of conscious life, but it is fragile. It is much easier to access when the system feels safe enough, steady enough, and unhurried enough to allow it. Under pressure, fast processing often takes the lead, and because fast processing is efficient, the slower mind may not even realize how much has already been set in motion until afterwards. You can see this outside conflict too. Imagine someone checking a message from a person they care about. The reply is shorter than expected. Nothing explicitly bad is written, but the response is different enough to trigger a subtle shift. Before any deliberate interpretation has formed, there may already be a drop in the stomach, a tightening in the chest, a sense of distance, a rush of inward explanation. Within seconds, the mind is filling in gaps. Have I done something wrong? They're pulling away. Something's off. I knew this would happen. All of that can unfold long before there has been any careful reflection on what is actually known. This is why timing is so important in emotional life. If the slower mind only enters once the story is already in motion, it often ends up reasoning inside a frame that was built by fast processing. It is no longer evaluating from open ground. It is evaluating from within a state. State changes everything. A slower, more reflective awareness is far more likely to ask, what do I actually know? What am I assuming? What else might explain this? Is this reaction fully about the present, or is something older participating? But if that slower awareness arrives too late, the loop may already have hardened. That hardening is what many people experience as inevitability. They say, once I'm in it, I'm in it. That often makes sense, because once a fast pattern has gathered enough emotional force, the slower mind is no longer meeting a neutral situation. It is a moving system. This is why some moments feel almost impossible to interrupt from the inside, not because we lack intelligence, but because the timing window is small. By the time the conscious, reflective layer enters strongly enough to observe, the emotional machinery may already be halfway through its sequence. That does not mean the slower mind is powerless. It means the work is often about learning to catch the sequence earlier in the body, earlier in attention, earlier in tone, earlier in the urge, earlier in the flash of certainty, earlier in the narrowing. The earlier you can notice, the more freedom there is. That freedom rarely begins as a grand transformation. It often begins as something much simpler. I can feel the shift starting. I can sense that I'm moving ahead of myself. I can hear that my tone has changed. I can tell I've already gone into defense. I can see that my mind is filling in the blanks too quickly. That kind of noticing is the beginning of real change, not because it eliminates fast processing, but because it creates a relationship between fast and slow. It gives the reflective mind a chance to meet the automatic one sooner. It turns reaction into something more observable. And once something becomes observable, it becomes less total. That is where this part of the episode is leading. Fast processing is part of how we survive, orient, and move through life. Slow processing is part of how we reflect, revise, and become less bound to what moved first. The problem is not that one exists and the other exists. The problem is that many of us live as though the fast layer is reality itself, and the slower layer only enters after the shape of the moment has already been decided. So the practice becomes learning to notice the sequence before the sequence decides everything for us. Because the first shift toward greater awareness is often not that we stop reacting. It is that we begin to see the reaction arriving, and once we can see that, the war between the two minds starts to become less invisible. Why the mind tells stories after the body reacts, one of the most unsettling things to realize about ourselves is that the story we tell about a moment is not always the thing that created the moment. It often feels as though it is. It feels as though we thought something, then felt something, then acted. It feels as though the explanation in the mind was the origin of the experience. That is how many of us naturally organize our memory of events. We remember the reason we gave, the thought we had, the conclusion we reached, the words we used. And because those things are easier to recall than the subtler movement underneath them, they begin to take center stage. The story becomes the event, but often the sequence is more complicated than that. Often, the body reacts first. The nervous system shifts first. Attention narrows first. Something contracts, braces, reaches, flinches, defends, withdraws, or prepares. Only then does the mind begin assembling a story that explains what has already begun. That is not a flaw in the mind. In one sense, it is part of what the mind does. It interprets. It organizes. It tries to create coherence. It gives shape to experience after experience has already started moving through us. The difficulty is that we are not always aware of that timing. So the explanation arrives wearing the authority of origin, even when it may have come later. This is why so many of us trust our reasons more quickly than we trust our sequence. If I can explain why I was angry, I assume the explanation caused the anger. If I can justify why I pulled away, I assume the justification came first. If I can name why I felt threatened, I assume the conscious naming was the source of the whole experience. But often the feeling was already moving. The body had already decided something mattered. The nervous system had already shifted state, and the mind stepped in to make sense of what it found. That changes how we need to think about self-understanding. Because self-understanding is not only about what story we can produce after the fact, it is also about how closely we can observe what began before the story was formed. That is where a lot of our blind spots live. A reaction happens, the body changes, the atmosphere shifts, then thought rushes in and says, here is why. Sometimes that why is partly true. Sometimes it captures a real piece of what happened, but sometimes it is too neat, too quick, too loyal to the self-image we prefer, too eager to preserve coherence, too willing to convert a fast reaction into a clean narrative. The narrative sounds reasonable, we accept it. This happens in very ordinary ways. You leave a conversation and tell yourself, I'm annoyed because they were disrespectful. That may be true, but it may also be incomplete. Perhaps what really happened was that their tone touched an older sensitivity. Your body tightened immediately, and your mind then built the explanation from inside that tightened state. You put something off and tell yourself, I just work better under pressure. That may contain some truth, but perhaps another part of you was avoiding the discomfort of beginning, and the story about pressure arrived afterwards to protect continuity. You turn down a social invitation and say, I'm just protecting my peace. Sometimes that may be exactly right, but sometimes protecting peace is the language the mind uses to dignify a reflex of avoidance, exhaustion, fear of exposure, or low-grade social overwhelm that has not yet been fully felt. This is why post hoc explanation can be so convincing. It often uses real language. It often contains part of the truth. It often sounds coherent, and coherence is emotionally soothing. A coherent story restores a sense of authorship. It tells us who we are and why we did what we did. It protects us from the more unsettling possibility that much of our experience begins outside the clean boundaries of conscious reasoning. But if we always accept the first coherent story, we can remain strangers to deeper patterns for years. Because the mind is very good at producing explanations that are plausible enough to satisfy thought, even when they do not yet reach the root of what is driving the behavior. This is especially obvious in moments of conflict. An argument begins, something in the body shifts quickly. Maybe there is a flash of shame, or threat, or dismissal, or fear of being controlled, or fear of being unseen. But those experiences move fast. They are often difficult to catch directly. So instead of feeling the deeper shift clearly, the mind produces a more accessible story. They never listen. They always do this. They're trying to manipulate me. I have to defend myself. I need to explain properly. Again, that story may not be entirely false, but it may not be first. It may be what the reflective mind builds to justify a state that has already taken hold. That is why two people can walk away from the same argument with entirely different stories, each of them sincerely convinced they know what happened, while neither has fully tracked the sequence inside themselves. What they often know best is not what moved first, but what meaning they assigned once the movement was already underway. That distinction is everything, because if the meaning is mistaken for the first event, then the loop remains hidden. The body reacts, the mind explains, the explanation is believed. The deeper sequence remains unseen. The pattern repeats. This is one reason insight can feel so frustrating. Many of us do eventually realize, often in quieter moments, that the story we told during the reaction was not the whole truth. We think back later and see more clearly. We notice that the intensity didn't really match the moment. We recognize that something older was involved. We realize that our explanation was too narrow, too rehearsed, too certain, or too flattering to the version of ourselves we wanted to preserve. And then we say, I knew better. But what does that actually mean? Usually, it means that the reflective mind in a coma state can now see what was previously hidden. It means awareness has widened enough to hold more of the picture. It means the story has loosened slightly, and the sequence is becoming more visible. That is valuable, but it is also why knowing better after the event does not always prevent the event next time. Because it is one thing to understand a pattern after it has happened. It is another thing to recognize it as it begins, and it is another thing again to remain steady enough in the beginning of it that you do not hand total authority over to the first explanation that arrives. That is where practice comes in. The goal is not to stop the mind from explaining. Explanation has a place. Meaning matters. Reflection matters. Language matters. The goal is to become less hypnotized by the first story and more curious about the deeper sequence underneath it. What shifted in me first? What did my body register before my explanation formed? What feeling moved too quickly for me to name in the moment? What assumption arrived with speed and certainty? What did the story protect me from having to feel more directly? Those questions do not make us less intelligent. They make us more accurate, because often the first story is not a lie. It is a surface translation, and if we stop there, we remain on the surface. You can see this in subtler, quieter forms too, not only in conflict, but in everyday mood, energy, and identity. Someone wakes up heavy, flat, or restless, and the mind immediately starts looking for a reason. Maybe it lands on work, on relationships, on lack of motivation, or on some global judgment about life. Sometimes it may be right. But sometimes the mind is simply unwilling to tolerate a state without immediately narrating it. It would be better to have a reason than an unknown. It would rather have a story than remain in contact with the rawness of not yet understanding. That tendency is deeply a part of us. We prefer coherence to uncertainty. We prefer explanation to ambiguity. We prefer a story we can hold to a feeling we cannot yet organize. But awareness grows when we become capable of delaying that rush just slightly. Not forever, not as an intellectual trick, but enough to ask, what is actually happening here before I lock it into language? That small pause can change a great deal, because it gives us a chance to notice that the story may be arriving second. It gives us a chance to feel the body's participation in the event. It gives us a chance to sense where certainty is being fueled by the state rather than grounded observation. It gives us a chance to recognize that the narrator in the mind is often working hard to create continuity, dignity, and order after something less tidy has already happened. Once you begin to see that, your relationship to your own mind changes. You stop taking every explanation at face value, not in a paranoid way, not in a hostile way, but in a more patient way. You begin to listen to yourself more deeply. You hear the story, but you also ask what the story is standing on. You listen to the reason, but you also ask what state the reason emerged from. You allow the explanation, but you no longer assume it is the first or deepest layer of truth. That's a very important shift, because the mind that explains is not the enemy. It is part of the way we become conscious of ourselves, but it needs a relationship, not blind trust. It needs to be met with curiosity, not total identification. It needs to be recognized as a narrator that often enters after the movement has begun, and when we begin to relate to it that way, we become less trapped by our first stories. We become more able to notice the difference between reaction and reflection, more able to feel when the body has moved first, more able to catch the moment when explanation becomes defense, more able to ask whether the story is clarifying reality or replacing it. That is where this part of the episode lands. The mind tells stories after the body reacts because that is part of how it restores coherence, authorship, and meaning. But if we mistake those stories for the whole truth, we stay stuck inside patterns we can describe beautifully without ever quite interrupting. The real work is not to silence the story, but to see it in context as one layer of the event, not the origin of all of it. Once we start doing that, the conflict between the two minds becomes much easier to recognize, because the storyteller is no longer mistaken for the whole self, and the deeper movement is no longer completely invisible. How inner conflict becomes outer confusion once we begin to see the split between the mind that speaks and the mind that runs ahead. A lot of ordinary confusion starts to make more sense, because inner conflict rarely stays neatly inside. It spills outward, into relationships, into choices, into tone, into timing, into self-trust, into the stories we tell about ourselves and each other. What begins as tension between different layers of the mind often becomes confusion in the life we are actually living. That is why this matters. This is not just an interesting theory about consciousness or psychology. It is part of why so many of us feel divided in ways that are difficult to explain. One part of us is trying to move in one direction, while another part keeps dragging us toward the familiar. One part wants intimacy, while another organizes around protection. One part wants rest, while another still treats stopping as unsafe. One part wants honesty, while another still fears what honesty might cost. When those layers are not in relationship with each other, the outside of life starts looking inconsistent. We send mixed signals. We confuse people. We confuse ourselves. We promise things we cannot yet sustain. We speak from one state and act from another. We say what we mean in one moment and abandon it in the next. That inconsistency can become painful very quickly, because it affects self-trust. When you keep saying one thing and doing another, eventually something in you starts to doubt your own words. You stop fully believing in yourself. You make a promise, but part of you already expects it to collapse. You set an intention, but another part is quietly waiting for the older pattern to take over again. After enough repetitions, the inner experience becomes something like, I can hear what I'm saying, but I no longer know if the rest of me is coming with me. That is a hard feeling to live with. Many of us respond to that feeling in ways that make the confusion worse. We become harsher with ourselves. We accuse ourselves of weakness. We demand more discipline. We over-explain. We overpromise. We try to force coherence through language alone. But if the conflict is deeper than conscious thought, then thought by itself will rarely be enough to resolve it. That is why so much of inner conflict becomes outer confusion in relationships. You may genuinely want closeness and still withdraw when someone gets too near. You may genuinely want to be understood and still become defensive the moment someone touches something vulnerable. You may genuinely value honesty and still find yourself editing, softening, performing, or protecting. Not because you are deliberately deceptive, but because different layers of you are responding to different realities. One layer is responding to what you consciously want now. Another layer is responding to what it learned long ago to expect, fear, or survive. Unless those two layers begin to come into a relationship, the outside world receives contradiction. This is where a lot of relational pain comes from. Not always malice, not always manipulation, often misalignment. We say yes while resentment builds underneath. We say we're fine while the body says otherwise. We ask for openness but react poorly when the real truth arrives. We want calm but keep feeding the dynamics that produce chaos. We say we have changed, and perhaps one part of us really has, while another part still lives by the old script, under pressure. That creates confusion not only for us, but for the people around us, because they are trying to respond to what we say, while also feeling what we are carrying. When those two things do not match, trust becomes harder. This is also why insight without embodiment can feel so frustrating. You can see the pattern, you can name it, you can explain its origins, you can even predict when it is likely to happen again, and still, when the right cue appears, some deeper layer takes the lead. That gap between understanding and living can be painful in a very particular way, because it leaves you with enough awareness to witness the contradiction, but not yet enough integration to consistently interrupt it. So you end up watching yourself repeat things you already know, and that can feel unbearable. It can feel humiliating. It can feel exhausting. It can feel like you are divided against yourself. But this is exactly why the right response is not more self-contempt. The right response is deeper observation. Because once you understand that inner conflict becomes outer confusion, you stop treating the confusion as random. You stop assuming that every contradiction means you are fake or hopeless. You start asking better questions. What part of me was speaking there? What part of me was reacting? What deeper expectation took over? What felt threatened? What was I trying to protect? What did I say I wanted? And what did another layer of me still believe? Those questions do not remove the pain immediately, but they do begin to organize it. They turn confusion into something readable, and that matters because unreadable pain becomes shame very quickly. Readable pain becomes information. That is the shift this part of the episode needs to make. Inner conflict is not just something you think about privately. It becomes visible in the life you are living. It shapes your choices, your reactions, your relationships, your self-trust, and your sense of who you are. And until you begin to see that the confusion outside often reflects a conflict inside, you will keep trying to solve it only at the level of behavior, without understanding the deeper split producing it. That is where the real work begins, not in pretending the contradiction is gone, but in learning to read it more honestly. Integration, learning to observe the sequence. So, where does all of this leave us? If there really is a split between the mind we know and the mind that runs ahead, then the work is not simply to think more, explain more, or criticize ourselves more harshly. The work is to begin observing the sequence. That is where greater awareness starts to become practical, not in abstract theories about the mind, not having the perfect explanation after the fact, but in learning to notice what happened first. Did the reaction arrive before the reasoning? Did the body shift before the story formed? Did the feeling harden before the words caught up? And did you only understand what was happening once the moment had already moved past you? Those are important questions because most of us have spent years judging the reaction without ever really learning to observe the sequence that produced it. We judge ourselves for being defensive, but we do not notice the first tightening. We judge ourselves for withdrawing, but we do not notice the first flicker of overwhelm. We judge ourselves for repeating the loop, but we do not notice the cue that activated the loop before our conscious mind had properly arrived. And if we do not notice the beginning, then we will keep trying to solve everything at the end. We will keep trying to reason our way out of states that were already organized long before the reasoning began. We will keep trying to correct the behavior without understanding the timing. We will keep confusing awareness with hindsight. But hindsight is not the same as presence. Presence begins earlier. It begins when you can feel the body changing before the explanation takes over. It begins when you can sense the pace quickening inside you. It begins when you can hear the certainty in your mind and recognize that certainty may be coming from activation, not clarity. It begins when you can notice that one part of you is speaking, while another part is already bracing, already predicting, already leaning toward an older pattern. That is the real value of this episode. Not simply that it gives you a model of two minds, but it gives you a different way of watching yourself, more gently, more precisely, more honestly, because the goal is not to dominate the deeper mind through force. The goal is not to declare war on the subconscious, as though one part of you must defeat the other. The goal is a relationship. The goal is literacy. The goal is to become more aware of the interaction between conscious intention and deeper patterning, so that the split becomes more visible and, over time, less absolute. That means learning to ask, what moved first in me? What did I feel before I explained? What did I predict before I perceived clearly? What older expectation came alive in that moment? And what was the deeper part of me trying to protect? That last question matters because what looks like sabotage is often protection wearing old clothes. And until that is understood, we will keep turning inner conflict into shame rather than insight. So perhaps the most useful closing thought for this episode is this: you do not become more conscious simply by having better thoughts about yourself. You become more conscious by learning to observe the sequence more clearly, by noticing the first movement, the first tightening, the first urge, the first distortion, the first shift in state. That is where the gap begins to close. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough for the reflective mind to arrive earlier, enough for awareness to meet what used to remain automatic, enough for the inner war to become less hidden and therefore less total. So let's conclude this episode. This episode has really been about one of the most intimate contradictions in ordinary life: the fact that we can know something consciously and still live against it. We've looked at the mind we identify with, the part of us that explains, reflects, plans, and says that we've looked at the deeper mind that runs ahead, the faster, more patterned, more predictive layer shaped by memory, repetition, feeling, and embodied expectation. We've looked at the timing between them, the stories that form after the body has already shifted, and the way inner conflict becomes outer confusion in the lives we actually live. And through all of that, one thing becomes clearer: we are often less unified than we imagine. But that does not mean we are hopeless. It means we need to learn to see more honestly, not just what we think, but what moved first. That is where the work begins. The body before belief. In the next episode, we move deeper still, because if one part of us is reacting before the conscious story forms, then we need to ask, where is that reaction happening? How does it become so fast, so convincing, so physically real before thought has fully caught up? In the body before belief, we'll explore why the body often reacts before the mind explains, why physiology shapes interpretation more than most of us realize, and why two people can hear the same words and live inside completely different realities. Because the body is not waiting politely for thought to permit it to respond. It is already participating. Until next time, stay curious about what moved first. You've been listening to the Consciousness Code Podcast, episode 22 Minds at War. I'm James Miller.